Thank you very much. You should have in your packet a handout that's about 4 pages long, or if they're double-sided, it'll be a couple pages. So those will be the main points that I'm going to cover today. I'm going to try and define for you what ageism is. I want to take you on a little trip with some things about my own personal life, about myths and philosophies of aging, and how we get put in a situation where we come up with perhaps falsehoods about aging. Sorry, I'm taller.
Yeah.
If you can't hear, you just raise your hand and I'll speak louder. Okay. Then what I'd like to do is talk about philosophies and how they get started and what we can do about them. I want to talk to you about the functions of ageism in this country and what it's allowed us to do and not to do. Then I would like to summarize for you what I think we need to do as people who work for and on behalf of older people. We're going to have some slides this morning. If somebody wouldn't mind flipping the power button on down on that slide projector. It's right on the top. Ageism is defined as a process of systematic stereotyping. You don't need to write this down because it's in your handout, so we'll just go through it, okay? And discrimination against people because they are old, just as racism and sexism accomplish this for skin color and gender. The socialization process has a great influence on how each of us view aging and the aged. Some people are raised by, by someone or exposed to older people that are very caring and warm to them. I happen to have been largely raised by my grandmother, who was a Canadian. She was a strong woman. But from the time I was a small boy, she had me 10 hours a day, as my mother and dad both worked. And my grandmother became something very, very important in my life. She had the best dishes that I've ever tasted. She made goulash and hash that nobody, I don't think they know what that is, but I happen to love it, and I've never found anybody who can make it, like my grandma. She also had some lemon pie, and she used to make scones, and I got to where my grandma was the most beautiful woman in the whole world. And when my grandmother died, I had a very difficult time losing her in my life. People have asked me often why I ever went into gerontology, because young people don't do that, right? When I started into gerontology in 1969, people said, what future is there in that field? And why are you going to go work with old people? Old people aren't people to work with. And the only thing that I could come back to that made any sense to me was that I was raised by my grandmother. Now, some people don't have the opportunity to be exposed to caring older people. And for that matter, close relationships with any older person may never develop. And yet, older people are active and they're enjoyable. And yet ageism ends up being based on prejudices, misunderstandings, on cultural influences and social values. Myths about the elderly abound in our society, largely because we have only looked at the book cover and not read or digested the content of the book. We've not become acquainted with older people as they were or as they currently are often. We make judgments about, I may need a drink of water, please. We make judgments about older people based on their appearance or what we have been socialized to believe about them, both of which may be very misleading. Older people are often categorized as senile, as rigid in thought and manner, and old-fashioned in morality and skills. Terms like crock and gomer and vegetable are common. The old geezer, the old fart, the dirty old man, the crabby old woman, the old biddy, are all terms used by others to denote old age. And it's not something to be desirable. I work in a medical setting now, where I worked in universities prior, and I still hear those who work with the older people all the time end up using similar terms, and I wonder, what is it that's inside them that tells them that it's all right to call these older people by these names? And well, you can't quite see that. It says, for crying out loud, you guys, I was hibernating. Don't you guys ever take a pulse? I would suggest to you that people in the medical field at times will have that kind of concern, and so will the rest of us. And we look at the book cover and we don't really try to understand what's going on at times. Pat Moore, a 26-year-old industrial designer from New York City, wanted to understand more about aging, something that hits many of us at one point in our life. In order to do that, she took a class. At what university, I don't know. But as she got into this class, she found out that she really didn't understand aging very well, and she didn't feel like the class had helped her. Now, that's one of my areas of major concern, is instruction that we give and what we convey to people that are in our classes. But anyway, she didn't feel satisfied. So she decided to learn how to dress herself as an 85-year-old woman. She used wax, she used wrapping, she used makeup, she used a wig, she used a cane. She got to a point where you could hardly distinguish that she really was not an 85-year-old woman. She spent 3 years going into 14 different states in the United States, dressed as an older woman. And I would like to share with you some of what happened. She met people who would joke somewhat about her age. And they would say, at my age, honey, I don't even buy green bananas. Now, I don't know whether you take that as a humor on a positive side or whether you take it as negative. It is hard to be nostalgic when you can't remember anything. And so there were people that made jokes about that. But she began to believe that the problem was they weren't educated. And so if you think education is expensive, I'd like you to try ignorance. She went into a store. She wanted to buy some hairspray. And when she went in as an 85-year-old woman. The clerk said, they're back in the back, about the 4th row over on the bottom shelf. He seemed to be very abrupt, and she went back, and he should have noticed she had a cane, but she had to bend down, pick it up, and come back, and he took her money, and that was fine. She went back later into the same store for the same product as herself, as a 26-year-old, young, attractive lady. And when she asked for the product, the clerk said, oh, I'll show you where that is, walked her back, bent down, picked up the product himself, and handed it to her. And she said, what is wrong in society? She was standing in line at an airplane, to get on an airplane at one point, and she came up to the ticket agent, and the ticket agent seemed to be very, very cross with her. Just go right on, ma'am. And that was all he had to say as he punched her ticket. Up came a young businessman dressed in a suit, and he started up a conversation and talked with her and with him and tried to enjoy him, and etc. And she said, why didn't he talk to me a little bit? And she began to wonder. Eventually, she was victimized by a gang. She was robbed and she was beaten as an 85-year-old woman. But then she also started to learn some positive things. Older people that she met seemed to understand her and seemed to be concerned about her. An older man who'd been widowed for some years began to fall in love with her. And she soon had to get out of that gracefully without breaking her disguise, which she did. She met a little boy one day on a beach, and he said, would you like a cookie? And she says, no, thank you. And she noticed the very despondent look on his face and thought, oh, I better not do that. So she said, well, on second thought, I think I would like a cookie. And so he gave her a cookie. He said, would you like to walk down the beach? I'll find some shells for you. And she said, well, okay. So he reached up his little hand. She took him by the hand, and they walked down the beach. As they walked, he asked her questions and talked to her and pointed out things in the ocean. And she realized that you should live every day with the innocence of a young person and not prejudge and not be worried about everybody's out there to take something from you. She discovered then that it was important to hold on to the innocence of youth. She discovered that it was important to keep the emotions alive in your heart. But if we're going to, I would suggest that what John F. Kennedy said is important. The time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. And so today's choices for tomorrow. Professional health and social service providers, planners, teachers of gerontology and geriatrics who are involved directly or indirectly with the elderly, more than any others, ought to be aware of how they see aging. The aging as a process, who they think are old, and who they believe are aged. Each should revisit their beliefs and attitudes about aging and older people. I would suggest to you that ageism is insidious, and it may find its way into our professional activities without our recognition. As you think about aging, what is aging? Have you ever tried to define it for yourself? Have you ever tried to tell anybody else what it is? I would suggest to you that the aging process is species-specific. It's sequential, it's cumulative, and it's deleterious. Now, people don't have any problem with the first three characteristics of that term, but they have some problem with the latter one. Some people want me to believe and want me to change the notion that aging is deleterious. But I would suggest to you that it is a process that moves from elementary to advanced levels, that it does take away from the ability to function, it does cause problems, it's not a disease, and it is not reversible. It gradually takes away of our ability to do what we would like to do. The effects of aging limit ourselves. And aging occurs in all realms of our functioning. It occurs intellectually, it occurs physically, emotionally, socially, spiritually, and psychologically. But the companion process that goes along with aging at the same time, development, also has the first three characteristics in common, but its last characteristic is that it enhances the ability of the organism to function. It improves our ability to deal with life. We might categorize wisdom and the passage of time and experience in that category of enhancing our ability to do things. I would suggest to you that both of these processes proceed from conception across the lifespan. In the early years, cell loss, or aging, is necessary for the development of new and more useful cells. Old tissue is replaced with new tissue. Could it also be true that social and psychological aging produces new and more useful social relationships and psychological abilities? Is it true by the loss of one function that we might improve another set of functions? People who have lost their vision oftentimes improve other senses and make them more sensitive and susceptible or sensitive to things in their life. I've worked with people who are blind and who are deaf. I've worked with Down syndrome children. I've worked with mentally retarded adults. And in each case, when you lose something, they seem to compensate in a way that many of us who have our full functioning really do not adjust, and we don't have the same sensitivity. So I would suggest to you to think of both processes at the same time. The next question about who is old. Who is old in your estimation? Is it defined by age? If you use the criteria of Administration on Aging, when are you old? Anyone? 60 years of age, because at 60 you qualify for all of the Older Americans Act funded programs. If you use the criteria established by AARP, then when are you old? What? 50, because you can join the organization at the age of 50. And have you ever wondered, when you're age 50 and you get this invitation in the mail, how they ever got your name? And do you think you're old when you get it? Or do you toss it in the round file? The problem is you get it the next year when you're 51. And on until hopefully they catch you and you join. Then there are commercial groups that will define for you who is older. How many of you ski? Have you ever been to a ski resort that has senior discounts? At what age do you qualify for senior discounts as a skier? 70? Well, I happen to know of a ski resort without telling you where it is. But you qualify as a senior skier if you're 40. Now, I would suggest to you that I am not sure that very many people are willing to go stand in line at the senior discount line when they're 40 years old. And so something goes on, but they define by age, and I think that all you need to think about now is that age is really a ploy. It is not a marker of anything. It's a simple ploy. And people have marketed by it, and I think they've done us a disservice. How about doing it by function? When you can no longer do something. One person said you can take no credit for beauty at 16, but if you're beautiful at 60, it will be your soul's doing. And that somehow beauty comes from within. But somebody else says, do not resist growing old. Think of the millions denied the opportunity. The best thing to say for old age is yourself. And I would suggest to you that many of us need to think that aging does not equal frailty. We are not old unless we begin to perhaps consider ourselves as old. And just because we get sick and we are limited in function does not mean necessarily that we have aged. So when we think about who the aged are, if we don't want to define who old is, then maybe we need to talk about who they really are. Now, if I say to you, the 85-year-old woman, does that mean they're aged? Or if I say to you, the 100-year-old man, does that mean they're aged? They are a group who is very old chronologically, and perhaps not very functional. But what if you find a 100-year-old who's more functional than you are? And then it doesn't make any sense. But they are always different from you and I. They are always different from you and I, no matter how old we get. If you go to meet with an 85-year-old person and say, we'd like you to come and join with us at the nutrition program, you're a senior citizen now, and they look at you and say, I'm not going to go to that place where those old fogies are. And you wonder, how can they define themselves that way because they're 85? What happened to you when you got some of these? Or when you couldn't stay up all night like you used to? Or when you couldn't digest something that you could? Or you couldn't outrun your son or your daughter? Or do something that you used to do with them? This is one of our patients at the hospital. He looks frail, and he looks old, and he certainly has a number of things wrong with him. But perhaps you may think of it this way. If your dreams you've left behind, if hope is cold, if you no longer look ahead, if your ambitions' fires are dead, then you are old. But if from life you take the best, and if in life you keep the zest, if you love, you hold, no matter how the years go by, no matter how the birthdays fly, you are not old. A man close to me had written this. This man is 99 years old, another patient of ours, and he's willing to exercise, his attitude is good, and he functions quite well. So somewhere along the line, if you think about who is old and who are the aged and what is aging, you have to start thinking about your own philosophy. Maurice Philibert, a professor of philosophy from the University of Grenoble in France, came to this country years ago and lectured across the United States. And he kept asking all of us to question about ourselves and to question ourselves with regards to our philosophies about aging. And he said, does your philosophy of aging consider the process to be? Now, if you'll turn to that page, I would like you to just take a pencil or a pen, and I would like you to circle your response to those 4 questions. So first of all, does your philosophy of aging consider the process to be, is it mainly biological? Or is it social, spiritual, or cultural? So circle one of those. Move to the next question. Is it a process of growth and promotion or a process of decline and demotion? Circle your response. Third question. Do you think of aging? Do you see it primarily as a natural and universal process or a differential and variable one? Circle your response. And the fourth question, is it an uncontrollable, unmanageable process, or a controllable and somehow manageable process? Now, these 4 questions he asked time after time after time. Mainly biological or mainly social and spiritual? I'm reminded of a story from a book on culture and aging, where a young man had been sent out into the woods to kill an animal at the age of 12. The process was that he was to kill the animal, skin it, drain the blood out of it, bring it all to the fire with all of the elders in the camp, and then they were to drink the blood and they were to talk about what had happened. When this occurred, this young man was then told by the elders that he now was old, for he had gone through this process and he now had aged, and he would sit with the elders for the rest of his life, and he was 12 years old. But he'd gone through the rite of passage, according to that tribe, and that's what made him an elder. Another story from this book was where a young man had left the country of Africa and had gone to England to study. And when he came back, after he had finished his studies, he sat with members of the tribe and he explained to them what he had seen and what he had heard. And after he finished, one of the elders stood up and said, "You indeed are older than I, for you have seen and heard with your eyes what I have only had some idea about, and you now are old." So wisdom made this man old, even though he was young chronologically. So perhaps, rather than thinking of it biologically, we might think of it as cultural, or social, or spiritual. You gain strength, according to Eleanor Roosevelt, courage and confidence by every experience which you meet. You must stop, look fear in the face. You must do the thing you think you cannot do. And if you know much about her biography or about her life, she was a person who let nothing stop her. She was socially conscious and worked and worked and worked for the benefit of everybody. Shakespeare said, "We know what we are, but know not what we may be." And so as you think about aging, perhaps we need to think of it as a social, cultural, spiritual thing rather than a biological thing. Another question, a process of growth and promotion or a process of decline and demotion? What did you circle? Again, this person that's close to me wrote this poem. When people's cars get old and worn and then begin to wobble, they take them somewhere, trade them in, and buy the latest model. Now I have often thought that when my joints are achy and when my hair has all turned gray and my knees are rather shaky, and when the march of time has left me rather feeble, how nice it would be when feet give out or when we have damaged livers, if we could go and buy new parts just like they do for flivvers. He had a hard time finding the word that matched that. So when my frame gets old and bent and gets to looking shoddy, how nice it would be to trade it in and get a brand new body. Now, you know, that's one way of looking at what happens. But we now are into a situation in our society where we're beginning to talk about wellness for elders, about prevention, about screening, about lifestyle changes. One of the major researchers, an MD, says an unused engine rusts, a still steam stagnates, and an untended garden tangles. Much of what we pass as age is disuse. And now they're finding that they can take the 70-year-olds who have declined in their ability to function and their respiratory and cardiac function. They can train them through a regular program of exercise, and they can bring them up to the level of conditioning of somebody who's 30 years of age. So maybe it's disuse. Again, Walter Bort said, "There is no drug in current or prospective use that holds as much promise for sustained health as a lifetime program of physical exercise." And I think if you look into some of the more current medical researchers that are looking at exercise in the elderly, you will find that that's the best pill they think they could ever prescribe for a human being. So I would suggest you may think of it as something as growth and promotion and not demotion. The third question, a natural and universal process or a differential and variable one? One cannot help getting old, but one can resist getting aged. Old age may seem a long way off, but on the day it doesn't, it will be too late to do anything about it. I do pre-retirement education for corporations, and it's interesting to me that people who attend those corporation meetings are within a year to 6 months of retiring. Why is it that that happens? Why do people come 1 year or 6 months before they retire and think they can do much about it? Because we don't want to face retirement. Because retirement seems to be a negative thing in our life. We talk about retirement from something instead of retirement to something. And it's difficult to get people past that stage. But perhaps what we've got to do is to start to think about aging differently. And I would suggest to you that aging is very differential, and it's very variable. The fourth question, is it an uncontrollable and manageable process, or controllable and somehow manageable one? If you don't like the way you're feeling, change the way you were thinking. I have an 85, 86 now, year-old mother who has macular degeneration, who lives alone. She's been widowed for almost 13 years. And I have to tell you that my mother's attitude is not good. She's lonely and she's isolated. We can't get her to move into a congregate housing facility. We can't get her to move in to live with us. She wants to remain as independent as she can be, and yet she's very alone. People call her once and then don't come see her anymore. She has some sisters who live in the same town, and they call each other on the phone, but my mother's beginning to lose her memory, and she forgets she calls them in the morning when she calls them back an hour later. She's a worry to us. And when we talk to her, we'll talk to her sometimes to try to get her to get out of where her attitude is about people who are worse off. And she'll say, oh, I'm really blessed. But that doesn't last for very long. And I would be honest with you, when you get into that situation and it's your own parent, it's much different than approaching it as a professional, because I'm always her son. I will always be her son. And no matter how much I know and what I can do for her, I'm still her son. And I have a very difficult time working with my mother. But she needs to change her thinking. And I'm not having much success in helping her do it. And perhaps if we took the approach that we don't need more strength or more ability or greater opportunity, what we need to do is use what we have. And there are some people who age very gracefully and who do that, and who are able to really use what they have and use it well. And those people seem to me to have so much self-esteem and so much self-worth. And you love to be around people that are like that. And so what happens is that when Philibert gets through his analysis of these 4 points, when he looks at those 4, this is what he would tell you. If you circled biological, you were most likely, after circling biological, to also circle decline, to also circle that was a natural and universal process, and to also circle that it was uncontrollable and unmanageable. He would suggest that when he had traveled across the world, that the people in the eastern part of our world tend to see it as a spiritual thing, as a cultural thing. They tend to see it as a process of growth and promotion. They tend to see it as differential and variable, and everybody has their way of approaching it. And they tend to see it as manageable and being able to do something about it. And after he'd lectured across the United States, he categorized the Western world to be one that tended to more see it as biological and biophysiological, and was suggesting to us that there's a different way to approach aging. Ageism has 4 functions. And these are the functions that seem to come out of the research literature. It allows younger people to see older people as different from themselves, and therefore reduce their own fears about aging. It allows all of us to avoid dealing with the reality of aging, at least for a period of time. It allows organizations and society as a whole to relieve themselves of responsibility toward older people. And it provides ammunition to create gaps between the young, the middle-aged, and the old. With regards to the first one, it does allow younger people to see older people as different from themselves. And when you see younger people and older people in the same situation, do you see them as just part of the lifespan together? That the young people someday too will be where the older people are? Or do we tend to see them as really separate categorically from each other, and therefore we must deal with them differently? It allows all of us to avoid dealing with aging and the reality of aging for a little while. My doctor told me to run 5 miles every day before breakfast, so I gave up having breakfast. And I would suppose that humor that we have about that, we tend to think of the image of youth as vigorous and sexy and powerful. It has its counterpart in the image of older people as incompetent, inflexible, wedded to the past, desexed, uncreative, poor, sick, and slow. The greeting card company recently created their black balloon collection. Hardly a joyful image. And these are the statements that occurred on this card. The front of the card said, "You just turned 30." The inside of the card said, "You will never have fun again for the rest of your life." The front of another card said, "Don't feel old, we have a friend your age." The inside of the card said, "And on good days he can still feed himself." When we ascribe to youth much of what is good about life and to being older every trauma and sorrow, we create an unrealistic and psychologically unhealthy environment for anyone beyond 25 years of age. The elderly themselves are misinformed and prejudiced about aging. In a joint study by the National Council on Aging and the Lewis Harris Polling Organization, men and women over 65 were asked whether they had enough money to live on. Only 18% said that they did not. But later on in the questionnaire, when the same people were asked what percentage of older people were struggling with poverty, they assumed that the figure of older people in that condition was greater than 50%. Why the reluctance to plan for our later life? I think it would be better if we approached our people in education situations about life planning, that there is a future for all of us. Older people oftentimes feed into this ageism propaganda. My mother has done that. They adopt negative definitions and misinformation about older people, and they perpetuate the stereotypes. They, in a sense, collaborate with the enemy. Some older people deny having birthdays. There are no more birthdays. Jack Benny is a good example. He never turned any older than 39 years of age. And they may then overestimate their capabilities and competencies. Others seem to accept their birthdays, but expect less out of themselves because they are getting older. And then there are those who are realistic and pragmatic about aging and development, and they seem to age gracefully. I have always enjoyed this particular poster. The sun setting is no less beautiful than the sun rising. And when you look at the perspectives of life as a total continuum, I think it may change exactly how we tend to think of aging. It allows organizations and society as a whole to relieve themselves of responsibility toward older people. Older people have been singled out as a special category to achieve the passage of major public laws. Social Security Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the Older Americans Act, and recently both the passage and repeal of the Catastrophic Health Coverage Act. The emotional appeal about caring for elderly causes tensions in society today because we face state and federal budget deficits, a move counter to raising revenue. Recent headlines in newspapers across the country are now creating an image of greedy geezers. Other headlines exhibit a similar idea that pits the younger generations against the older ones. The coming of conflict as we soak the young to enrich the old. Another title, generational fights seen as elderly push for benefits. Another title, age wars, the coming battle between the young and old. Today's elderly versus tomorrow's. Social Security is criticized for leveling a high payroll tax on a workforce that might never enjoy the level of assistance of today's beneficiaries. Medicare and Medicaid are under severe fiscal pressure, and federal and state governments continue to reduce coverage while increasing out-of-pocket expenses for health care recipients. Corporations are retracting the health insurance coverage of their retirees and shifting the retirement and pension programs from defined benefits to defined contributions. A doom and gloom climate based on the assumption that doing more for one group means doing less for another pervades our analysis and limits our options of addressing the population that's aging. Special interest group politics is challenging the gray lobby, which is a diverse collection of subgroups rather than a collection of one voice. Health and social service providers, educators, and other professionals have a responsibility beyond their jobs as enablers and advocates for their clients' self-actualization, empowerment, sense of self-worth, and independence. They have a responsibility, in my estimation, to fight this notion that the elderly are a separate category from everybody else. They have a responsibility to see the elderly as a continuum of just going on with life, and to see the similarities between the young and the old. Not to take away from someone that I was at dinner with last night, and not to be critical of that person, but when we were introducing ourselves around the table, she said, well, I'm at the other end of the lifespan of everybody that's here. I work with children. And I said, well, that doesn't put you apart from us. That just makes you part of us. And her comment was, well, but I work with children. And I said, that's fine. They grow up to be old, usually. And there are similarities between us. When you think about a transportation system, you want to look for frequent stops of the transportation system so it can pick up most people. You want to have shelters where people can stand if you're thinking about the elderly. You want to have a step that's wide that an older person can find with their foot. You want to have the riser on the step not very high because they cannot lift their leg up very high anymore unless they've had a regular exercise program. What other groups are in the same category as those that need the same kind of facilities with the public transportation system? Handicapped, children, am I right? That's what we need to think about, is not pregnant women. Yes. That's what we need to look at. Not as older people as a separate category apart from, but how do they work with the rest of those who need the same kinds of services. Dwight Eisenhower said this a long time ago. Farming looks mighty easy when you plow with a pencil and you're 1,000 miles from a cornfield. Now when you go to plan, if you've never been there, if you never did what Pat Moore did as an industrial designer and went out and found out how people treated an 85-year-old woman, we as professionals sometimes make major mistakes. And I would suggest to you that sometimes we don't plan properly. It provides ammunition to create gaps between the young, the middle-aged, and the old. The current Secretary of Aging, Fernando Torres Gil, in a recent book, The New Aging, Politics and Change in America, indicates how periods of time in which people were born and grew up would produce confusing attitudes about old people. During the young aging period, which includes people born before 1930, older people enjoyed respect and were in leadership positions. But during the modern aging period, which he terms between 1930 and 1990, old age has been classified as poor, frail, deserving, and disadvantaged. And now in the new aging period, he's suggesting that people are beginning to see the aged as greedy and well off and not deserving of any more services. And he suggested the things that influence us are a number. This happens to be somebody that I know who is a nurse that is working with this older gentleman. And this particular nurse had a difficult time in working through some things about being with the older person even though she enjoyed gerontological nursing, and dealing with her own personal attitudes about how sick they were and how what she was doing made no difference and how she couldn't reverse the process she was working with. And she used to talk to me that she thought maybe it was better that old nurses worked with old people. Now I don't know if you've ever felt that, but I've been in the position of trying to get jobs for young people in aging organizations. And I've had people say to me, what would a young person ever know about aging? And we wouldn't hire somebody like that. And I would try to explain to them that young people can become to feel and understand the processes of aging and understand what older people go through. They don't have to be old themselves. That they can find out what it's like. Pat Moore found out what it was like. And I'm not suggesting that all of us need to dress up and look older than we are to find that out, but I would suggest to you that we certainly can find it out. Good judgment comes from experience. And where does experience come from? Now, isn't that true? And young people can do that. And they do. And they learn from bad judgment and from making bad choices. And so this is the way that Doris Gill sets up this analysis that we need to look at for a few minutes. There are three distinct forces that are impacting our society. These forces are generational claims, diversity, and longevity. These three forces, unless we combine as a group and begin to look at them and fight against them and understand them, will cause us a lot of problem in the next 20 to 30 years. Generational claims are defined as claims upon the government based upon the generation that you belong to. The swing generation, this generation right here, born between 1900 and 1926, are currently the ages of 67 to 93. This group is commonly referred to as the young old or the old old of today. And there are approximately 55 million people in that age group. Their years of socialization occurred during the 1930s and 1940s, a time of extraordinary turmoil, economic depression, and a world war. They came to accept and support activist government during the New Deal and are now the greatest advocates for federal entitlement programs such as Social Security and Medicare. When they were socialized to be individualistic, and they bought that, they also believed that in a time of crisis, the government has a responsibility to respond and to help. And even though they still believe in self-reliance and the community spirit, they expect the government to help them. So they are now a very large lobby. The silent generation, born between 1927 and 1945, who are now between 48 and 66, this group is referred to as the middle-aged, and it's a smaller group of about 49 million people as a result of a drop in the birth rate during the Great Depression. This is the category that I live in. This silent generation was socialized during the 1940s and 1950s, and they benefited from the achievement of their parents, which produced the affluency of the 1950s to the 1980s. This group has challenged the definition of being old from poor and needy to being well off and productive. And when you talk with people, just the general public perhaps, and even those who are legislators, and you talk to them about the need for services for the older people, they will cite you all kinds of examples of people who are old who do not need any services and who are well off. And in a time of economic problems and deficits, you cannot put money to the old anymore. It's got to go to a different group of people. We reap, see this group right here, we reap the benefits in home equities, in retirement programs, and health benefits garnered from a strong post-war labor union movement. Many of us have multiple pensions, and we enjoy leisure and recreation that our parents before us did not, and maybe the generation to follow will not either. We're vulnerable for criticisms from young people because of the prosperity of their generation comes from the efforts of the earlier generations who fought World War I and World War II. Yet the older members of this silent generation are vulnerable to insecurity and anxiety, as are the members of the swing generation, to any changes that are provoked by reductions in entitlement programs, pension retirement programs, and increasing health care costs. Our social vision of programs for the elderly were based upon need and upon universality and equity, but when it comes to our own, and they're going to cut our programs, we get very, very concerned. Well, what are we going to do about that baby boom generation that was born between 1946 and 64, who are currently 29 to 47 years of age and equals 76 million people? At each stage of their lives, the needs and desires of the baby boomers have become the dominant concerns of American business and popular culture. This group has strong values about materialism and about individualism. The boomers are not even replacing themselves as a generation. An estimated 20% of the baby boomers will have no children, and 25% will only have one child. The females of this generation have the lowest fertility rate ever recorded in America. A large part of the reasons for the lower fertility rate, however, is the high cost of raising a child. And the worry about bringing a child into a world with the threats of unstable marital relationships, environmental concerns, decline in the quality of living, and the need for, but the lack of, employment. We have pitted the generations against each other. And we continue to do it in our legislative actions. We continue to do it perhaps even in our classrooms. And if you look at the two generations that are going to follow, the baby busters that are between 1965 and 1779 and are between 14 and 28, and this group is about 51 million people, they will reap the actions and the inactions of the baby boom generation. However we respond to that 76 million people who are baby boomers, these people will be the ones that take the brunt of what happens to them. Most of the projections are that both the baby boomers and the baby busters will look to nursing homes and home health agencies to satisfy the need of their parents. They will not see themselves as the caregivers of the elderly, which has been a common experience in the past. The baby boomlet generation represents the people born between 1980 and onwards. They're now between 1 and 13. Some of the events they've seen, like the space shuttle. But this group of people, according to the U.S. Department of Vital Statistics, now numbers about 46 million people. We must keep in mind that this group will probably grow a little larger to match the same age spans as the others. But we have got to do something to say to the generations that we need each other. If we continue to push for the elderly as a separate categorical group to be funded legislatively, if we look at age different than the rest of society, both who are currently born and those yet to come, we will be making major mistakes and we will get nowhere with social legislation services. We've reaped the benefits of having us as a separate group in the past, but we can no longer face that. If you look at diversity as the next issue, and when you begin to look at the populations of minorities, we now are no longer predominantly white, or largely middle income or middle class. We are no longer Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, or mainly English speaking. Or we are no longer politically centrist in our beliefs. The diversity in race and ethnic makeup, the discrepancies in income, the ratio of females to males, the residential location of the elderly will directly impact the access to services, the equitable distribution of scarce resources, and the financing of benefits. This diversity will force us to confront the need for change, to evaluate factionalism that has led to these categorical programs. Diversity will make solving problems more complex and politically sensitive. If you go to teach in most districts in California, if you do not speak Spanish, you will not get a job. And many parts of our country are changing. And we have got to become more and more sensitive to the diversity in our country and learn how to work with it in a better way. It will challenge us to look at the basic needs of every member of the nation, of our state, and of our local community. What is the bottom line for allocating scarce public resources? How can we ensure that basic needs such as health care and education and housing are met? How can we ensure that the social and economically needy are the ones who receive services regardless of their age, regardless of their interest group, regardless of what ethnic group they may belong to? The other thing that seems to be forcing us, as Torres Gill and others have said, to make a major decision is that of longevity. While it's a function of aging, mortality, life expectancy, and morbidity, we now have things that say the next 50 years, and many people live to be over 100. Over 2/3 of the increase in longevity the world over from prehistoric time until the present has occurred since 1900, within our lifetime. Longevity in human terms refers to the maximum period of time that members of a species live under optimum conditions. Leonard Hayflick, a biologist, believes that most of us now can live to be 115 years old. The increased lifespan will directly influence our restructuring and the modification of senior citizen benefits and programs and our approach to aging. Is this our view of aging? It's certainly been the view of many. Or, on the other hand, rather than looking at somebody who is in need of all of those wires and testing, we may look at this view. And while that's a little humorous, it is true that there are people that are that flexible at that age. It's interesting, as an aside, that the man that you saw on the previous slide with all the wires attached to him, he met this lady. And she convinced him that they ought to train, and they ought to get into good physical condition. And so they did. Now, I would suggest to you that while that's a little bit exaggerated, you really do find older people that are very, very healthy. And a lot healthier perhaps than people younger. It may be that we will require that older people continue to work in our society. That we need a productive workforce, and that the younger cohorts, because there's not enough of them, we've got to have healthy older people. How do we teach young people to plan for and use a longer lifespan productively? Will we plan for a comprehensive long-term care system offering elderly the choice of remaining at home and with their families and living on their own in the community? Or when it becomes necessary, entering an institution such as a hospital or a nursing home? How are we going to plan as young people for our own aging and for older people? How long will you live? I really don't know. And I have no idea how long I will live. But in summary, the U.S. is and will continue to become a nation of older and more diverse and more complex groups with a declining proportion of young people. More people will require assistance and will be without family support. We can expect greater tension and competition over the escalating costs of assisting an older and larger group of elderly people. Ageism will raise its ugly head, and it will come to haunt all of us. Age bashing will escalate. There will be more special interest groups who demand that their needs be met to the exclusion of assistance to older people. The challenge of changing this perspective is ours, those of us who work for and in behalf of older people. Adjusting to an aging society is a highly personal matter. What you and I do and say and believe and what our attitudes are will reverberate back to us as we get older. We are both part of the present and future problems, and we are part of the possible solutions. Are we ready? Are we willing to work together with people of all special interest groups for the betterment of all people regardless of their age, race, income level? Are we ready to redefine aging? J.C. Penney said, "I may be losing my eyesight, but not my vision." Do we have the vision of removing stereotypes? It is true that we lose things as we age. The large print giveth, and the small print taketh away. And we do need glasses, and we do need assistance with living. But does that mean we're non-functional? Are we ready to redefine the provision of old age benefits to account for increased longevity and greater diversity within the population? Are we going to institute new methods for education and training an older population in order to integrate them into the mainstream of society, to help them be productive, whether it's for paid work or not? Are we going to integrate genealogical education in the public school system to prepare young people for a long, productive life and one that values older people? I hope so. I hope that that vision comes to all of us, that we begin to see ourselves as working to defeat ageism in our country. I hope that we reflect frequently upon what we currently believe, because as I said in the beginning, ageism is insidious and it creeps into our thoughts and our actions and what we say and do. We must not only read the first and last chapters of a book, like sometimes we do if we're in college, but we need to look at everything in between the first and last chapter. We cannot judge America just by what we see on the outside. We can't judge the book by its cover. The generations have got to work together, using the knowledge that we have about our future demographics. We must adopt a tough-minded yet optimistic realism about our future. As I read the statistics of the state of Montana, The Census Bureau indicates that in 1990 there's 107,000 over the people over the age of 65. I'm sure that's more current since then, but what it is I don't know exactly. But when I looked at the statistics on the projections of those that are over 85, if you think of those as being aged, while in 1990 there was 10,676 of them, by the year 2000 in this state there will be 45,613 of them, and by the year 2010, which is in our lifespan, there will be over 100,000 of them that will be 85 years of age and older. What will the 11 area agencies on aging do in this state? What will the hospitals do? What will the social service agencies do? What will all of the organizations do to serve this group of aging people? In a survey conducted by people here in this state, of over 700 people, with having about 400 people respond, the question was, they wanted to have more information about functional health. They wanted to know more about programs to assist the elderly. They wanted to look at the social aspects of aging, and they wanted to know more about community resources. 60 to 65% of these 400 people who responded wanted that kind of information. Older people are a valuable resource. Many of them will work for free. Many of them just want to have something to do. Many of them have ideas and will share those ideas if they're asked. I would suggest to you that some of the reasons that we do not do things is that we are stagnated. The 7 steps to stagnation are as follows. We have never done it that way before. Are we stuck in a rut? We are not ready for that yet. Don't do it now. We're doing all right without it. We've worked fine in the past, no reason to change. We tried it once and it did not work. So don't ever try it again. It costs too much. That's the big out in today's society, and yet there's a way around it. That is not our responsibility. That belongs to that other agency across the street. It would not work anyway. I think that those 7 steps stop us from doing what we can do. I hope we will be open to new ideas, that we will share our local, state, and national resources with each other, that we'll face difficult and challenging times, but if we use our best thinking and we act boldly, and we're willing to take some risks and make some bad judgments and make some mistakes, the future will be exciting and rewarding. The more you give, the more you get, so said Robert Frost. The more you laugh, the less you fret. The more you do unselfishly, the more you live abundantly. The more of everything you share, the more you'll always have to spare. The more you love, the more you'll find that life is good and friends are kind. For only what we give away enriches us from day to day. We have a lot of ability in this room, a lot of resources, a lot of knowledge, a lot of energy. And I think that as a group of professionals working with and for the elderly, it's important to defeat ageism. You cannot let it continue. We must begin to work together with the other agencies who are in social services or who are in the health fields to look at what's equitable across the lifespan for all age groups. And then we have a chance of defeating ageism in this state and in our country. Thank you.